Welcome to Second Table, where we discuss spirituality, philosophy, and psychology. I'm your host, Winston Janis. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Second Table podcast. Thanks for listening. Today, I'm really excited to have another special guest, Diana Butler Bass, who is an American historian of Christianity, holds a PhD in religious studies from Duke University, and is an award-winning author of 11 books. Her most recent book, which was just released, is Freeing Jesus, Rediscovering Jesus as Friend, Teacher, Savior, Lord, Way, and Presence. So welcome, Diana. Glad to have you here.
It's good to be here. Whenever someone reads the entire title, I always think it sounds like a 19th century book. 19th century books almost always had these really long, very explanatory subtitles. And so I guess I've finally written a 19th century book.
I don't know, maybe that trend is coming back. I feel like a lot of, who was it, Richard Rohr and, Rob Bell, they kind of, I've seen a couple where there's like, how the Bible is going to change your perspective on the universe and everything in it, and kind of goes on and on like that. But yeah, so very exciting to be reading your new book. Tell me, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to write this project, how it's a little different from your previous books, and what made you write this one, and what's the mission behind it?
Well, I think I want to start a slightly different place than I've started with some other podcasters who asked me that question. I've told a story a bit in the last couple of weeks about how, in certain ways, Freeing Jesus was kind of an accident. I was planning on writing a different book, and then this one just sort of intruded on my writing process. So I wound up writing about Jesus. But in the pre-conversation, for the people who are your listeners, you and I just chatted for a moment about how you have an interest in the future of Christianity and what's going to happen with churches. So folks who know my work over a sort of longer span for the last 15 years or so, I have been really concerned about that question. What is the future shape of Christianity in a post-religious age, and sort of where the winds of American religion are taking us all. And so in 2012, I wrote a book called Christianity After Religion, and the subtitle on that was The End of Church and the Birth of a New Spiritual Awakening. And the title got me into some trouble because my friends were worried that I was advocating for the end of church. But what that book was simply a sort of historical, cultural reflection on what was going on, is that the end of conventional patterns of church going were ending in America. And the question was out there and still hangs out there. What comes next?
Right.
Those of us who care about Christianity and communal expressions of it, what happens now? And so in Christianity After Religion, the book is really divided up into 3 sections. And the first section of the book covers statistics and trends, sort of the demographics that everybody knows about now, but 10 years ago, people were far less aware of. How rapidly people were becoming none of the above, the growing sort of space of people of color in the religious rainbow of America. And so I look at that trend material. And then in the end of the book, I suggested that there might be, when one thing ends, usually something new is beginning. That's part of the Christian story. And so I suggested at the very end that what might look like an ending could actually be a new beginning. And it was in the middle of the book that I spent time in 4 chapters exploring the shape of faith. what was ending. So it wasn't just about demographics. This was actually about questions around faith and religious identity. What was ending, and how and what might be coming to be. And so there was a very simple pattern in that section of the book, where I looked at each of what sociologists refer to and anthropologists, religious studies professors call the 3 B's. And so if you take a religion 101 class, for example, this is most likely part of that class. The question is, what's religion? And one of the ways that religion has classically been defined is looking at how people understand their belonging, their sense of identity. That's 1B. How they behave, what their practices, rituals, etc., are in relationship to God. And so behavior, 2B. And then finally, what they believe. How they understand God to be. Mm-hmm. And so those 3 B's, believing, behaving, belonging, that is the sort of template upon which you can understand almost every sort of major world religious tradition. So, you just go in and you fill in the blanks. And so what I did was, instead of looking at, say, Hinduism versus Christianity, I looked at conventional Christianity versus what I thought was emerging forms of Christianity. And as I explored that, I made the suggestion that our sense of belonging was shifting from membership, belonging to an organization or institution, toward relationship. And that is, who do we find ourselves with whom are our lives linked, and how our identity emerges relationally. Mm-hmm. So that was the way I shifted the first B. The second B, with behavior, I said that the question had changed from how are we supposed to do that? Sort of in the older, more conventional world, if you had a question about religious behavior, you would look up the rule book.
Go to the minister, or
go to the minister, check out what the polity says of the organization, figure out how to run a meeting, read a book on how you're supposed to pray. So there were lots of sort of rules, guidelines, how-to books, those kinds of things. I'm an Episcopalian, and we call those things rubrics in our denomination. You follow the rules, the written rubrics of what you're supposed to do. So I said that was changing from how are we supposed to do it, the question of behavior, toward what are we supposed to do? And really, in a sense, that's a big part of religious life, spiritual, and the sort of spiritual quest of our time, is nobody really knows what to do anymore. Because all the old answers, all the old rule books, very few of them work. Mm-hmm. And they all feel constraining when they're deployed. So the new question is, well, what are we going to do? And when the answer is, well, we're going to have to figure that out together. We're going to have to enter into discerning that together. And then finally, that question of belief, we've shifted from a world where people generally ask, what do you believe? And I rarely hear that question anymore. People typically assume that they know what Christians believe. Mm-hmm. And the only time I ever hear that question, what do you believe as a Christian? Or, what do Christians believe about XYZ? Is when I'm being asked that question by, say, a Buddhist or a Muslim, somebody who's legitimately not related to the tradition. Mm-hmm. But the question I hear almost every single day of my life is, how do you believe that? And I get asked that question about all kinds of things. How can you believe in a good God when we've all been locked inside in a worldwide pandemic and more than 500,000 people in just our country alone have died?
Right.
So that's the how do you believe that question? How can you believe in a loving God with all that going on? And then also the questions like, how can you believe in the resurrection? Or how can you possibly believe in something called a virgin birth? Or, whatever the issue is, people are much more interested in the sort of the question of, is that even possible? And so the switch there in belief is from kind of an external set of doctrines and creeds. What do you believe? fairly easy to answer. You just hand somebody a book, say, this is what, Presbyterians believe, or this is what Baptists believe. And the answer now is in the realm of experience. And so every person has to answer that question and say, well, this is how I believe it, or this is how my community believes it. And I've experienced, or when I run into that question, this is how I think about it. And so it's a shift towards experiential belief. Well, that is a very long answer to a short question, is about the new book, Freeing Jesus, and where it comes from. Well, what happened was that middle part of Christianity after religion, after I wrote the book, I felt it was incomplete. And so what I launched on in the wake of that book in 2012 was I knew that I had to write another book. So I wrote a book about belonging, and that was a book called Grounded. And in that book, I talk about how we belong to neighbor and nature, and that in finding ourselves with our neighbors and in the world of creation and nature, we belong to God. And then I wrote a book about behavior. That was a book called Grateful, in which I talk about what I think is the most foundational of all spiritual practices, and that is the practice of gratitude, and how that practice relates to both our own healing and the healing of the world. And that meant, in this last year, when I got around to it, is that I needed to write a book about belief. And that's when I sat down at my desk and I started writing a more general theology book, a book about belief, and it wound up being a book about Jesus and what I've believed regarding Jesus through my experience in my own life. And so you ask a simple question, and what it winds up being is it winds up being literally 12 years of asking myself, what's ending and what's coming to be, and how can I, as a writer, share stories with the world that enables people to see this time that's rather chaotic and full of really, I think, questions that cause so much division and so much anxiety. How can I help people see the possibilities more clearly? And so that's what I've been doing. And Freeing Jesus is really, I think, the coda of that project.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really interesting and comprehensive sort of overview of your work and your career. It's I think that is really needed today. I mean, I feel like in a lot of conversations I've had, the issue that always seems to come up is how much change and transition people are going through in their experience of the world, in their self-understanding, and their understanding of the world and the universe. So, yeah, it's a time of kind of needing to kind of revisit some of these things and question them. And I think you're absolutely right too, where there is a shift towards experience, and it's not just right. Don't just tell me what to believe, but I want to experience for myself God and wholeness and a sense of the Spirit. But yeah, I think too, just how do we believe these things? It's true. A lot of people just feel like they just can't belong to the church anymore. They can't step into the church. And I get that's one recurring question that I have, and maybe you could speak a little to that as well, is can Christianity really overcome the baggage that it has? Is it destined to kind of go the way of the dinosaur?
Well, I'm a historian by training, and one of the things that I am quite aware of is that most predictions wind up on the rocks of history.
Yeah.
It's because we human beings, we can see a little ways ahead, and sometimes there are people among us who are much more clear-sighted or who know how to spot what's going on horizons better than others of us, but for the most part, we're always wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with the pandemic, one of the things that it has reminded us of is really kind of the fragility of our security. I think before this year, none of us ever knew we were going to live through something like this. And to have an event occur that is so sort of out of the window for most of us. I mean, there are that handful of people who study epidemics and pandemics, and they thought it was going to happen.
Mm.
But no, not many people were paying attention to them, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But to have something like this happen and sort of so quickly turn the patterns of life in the world upside down, inside out, and backwards, and have go through this process just reminds us that history is very unpredictable. And we can only make sort of best guesses.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, like you said, it does seem like we're on the verge of some sort of, major shift. I mean, I think, I want to say Phyllis Tickle or maybe some others had kind of said every 500 years, right, within the church, there's this major shift. And so it seems like we're due for that as well. And so, yeah, it's just that recurring question. But I mean, it does seem as though Jesus continues to be, as you said, a compelling figure for many people, even those who don't belong to a church. Why do you think that it might be that Jesus continues to have this incredible appeal and has obviously for a couple thousand years?
Well, it's a really funny thing when you talk about when Christians talk about Jesus. I think it's always really fascinating because we talk about Jesus like we know Jesus. And yet Jesus lived 2,000 years ago, and for all intents and purposes, should have been completely forgotten, lying in the dustbin of history a really long time ago. Is this a Jewish peasant who was sort of an itinerant teacher and miracle worker? And there were lots of those. And we don't know the names of all the rest of them. So it's a really, kind of wild thing that Christians talk about Jesus relatively easy terms, like, and we talk about Jesus like he's still alive. And so there is that. We clearly know Jesus, not through the way I would say know you, or know any of my friends or my husband or anyone else, because you're another human being who's alive at the same time I am, and we might get in the same room together and have a great talk. But instead we know Jesus through the experience of stories that have been handed down to us and of the people who have gone before us. And when I was writing Freeing Jesus, one of the moments in the writing process was I asked myself, when was the first time I ever heard the name of Jesus? And I grew up in a church, actually grew up in a church. I was baptized in a Methodist church that my great-grandparents helped to found. So basically, I don't ever remember a time when I didn't know Jesus, at least his name. And, I was baptized when I was 3 months old in that church, in a place where several generations of my family had lived and worshiped and been baptized. And so that kind of familiarity is the case for lots of people who are Christians. And I do know there are plenty of people who are Christians also who came to it somewhat later and might actually be able to remember the first time they really sort of clearly heard Jesus' name. And so not every story has to be like my story, but the truth of the matter is that if you are a Christian person, or if you're in a culture that is influenced by Christianity, you probably can't avoid hearing Jesus somewhere along the line. And as soon as you do, that opens up the question, oh, what's this guy all about? Why is he remembered? Why is a whole religious tradition, bear the name of one of his titles, Christianity? So it's a fascinating question, and people are compelled, I think, by interesting, even if you just think he's an interesting historical figure. There is fascination in that name. I'm kind of fascinated by the Dalai Lama,
Right.
in that sort of more generic sense. I can remember, however, when I didn't know the name of the Dalai Lama, I didn't know that was a title. And, I'm also fascinated by Muhammad, and I'm fascinated by Teresa of Avila, so there are figures whose names I did learn later on who have become part of my ability to be able to navigate the world of faith and spirituality. But that Jesus name, for those of us who grow up in cultures steeped by Christianity or cultures with Christian memory, Jesus is absolutely unavoidable.
Yeah. Yeah. It does seem to be the case, and, I think one of the things I really appreciated was the whole concept of sort of explaining, who Jesus has been to you throughout your life. And in a way giving the rest of us sort of permission to do that as well, to ask ourselves, and to reflect back on who Jesus has been to us through all different parts of our lives. And so I don't know, maybe the entire book is the answer to this question, but I kind of feel like asking you, so who is Jesus to you now?
In effect, Jesus is all of the Jesuses who do show up in the memoir. It's interesting because I kind of got fascinated by a comment you made about 15 or 20 comments ago, and that was this idea that we live in a time of change, and that people seem, and I agree with you, people are upset by change. And what was really interesting in the writing of this book was to go back and look at my own life as a story about change. In effect, there's this moment where I always I could kind of stand apart a little bit from things that I'm observing in the culture, not entirely, because we're always connected, but I can kind of look at it with a more distanced eye. And why would human beings be afraid of change? Because it's literally all we know. I mean, change is our deepest reality. I am not the same person that I was when I was 2 or 7 or 16 or 27. And I just had my 62nd birthday, which seems unbelievable to me. And so, I mean, I recognize that there's a thread of Diana. I have these memories, and these memories compose my life. But what is true is that I've changed. My body has changed. My ideas have changed. My appearance has changed. And the world around me has changed. And so, in effect, change is the most natural of environments for human beings.
Yeah, I wonder, though, if we kind of live in a perpetual state of denial about that in our culture, where we're sort of try to fight it, by trying to make ourselves look younger, or, when people die, I mean, a lot of times that's really hidden, right, from the view of the public. But yeah, it is a, like the Buddha, talked about the law of impermanence, in Buddhism and that kind of thing. It's so true. And yet I think it's scary because it reminds us of death. And, I think we fight it. We want to kind of control. I'm going to arrive at a certain point in my life when all of the puzzle pieces will be fitting together. I'm going to have my ideal job, my ideal house, my ideal family, partner, whatever it is, and then it's going to stay that way. I'm going to get to a certain level of physical well-being, and then nothing else bad will happen.
Yeah, that's not the way it works.
Right. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that I think that Buddhists, are sort of more honest about that in certain kinds of ways than Christians are. In effect, in Buddhism, you have this idea of it's when you try to cling to things, when you try to make what is impermanent permanent, that is the part of the cause of suffering.
Right.
And then so you live into, instead of trying to cling to this illusion of permanence, you live into the impermanence in meditation and letting go and being able to step into the river and all the different kinds of wisdoms and practices that Buddhism offers. In Christianity, we don't really do that. And it's sort of, I think, problematic on our part, is that we actually have a sense that there's this permanent state of perfection, and it's beyond us. It's the kingdom of heaven, or it's in the next life, or what have you. It rests with God, and we think that out there is this sort of permanent reality, and our struggle here is that everything. Why doesn't now reflect that? And so there's a lot of, I think, theological ways that Christianity kind of went wrong. Mm-hmm. And I literally talk about that in the beginning of Freeing Jesus. I talk about how one of what I call the clobber verses, the verses that people sort of pull out of their back pocket to stop a conversation. One of the clobber verses about Jesus is, you get to start talking about, Jesus, I kind of understood Jesus this way, and then I understood Jesus this way. Somebody will surely say to you, well, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that's supposed to be the end of the conversation. Jesus is permanent. And so what I say in the book, and I say it at the very beginning, because I knew this would come up with people, is that, okay, even if I grant you that, which I don't entirely do in the book, but even if I granted you that, we're not the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so that means that the way in which we approach, we relate to, experience, and apprehend who Jesus is changes the whole way through. And so, in effect, we come to know a multitude of different Jesuses in our own lives. And sort of the deeper theological push on that question, which I suspect, because of the things that you like, you will get when I say it, is that the way that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever is that Jesus is compassion. Jesus is the embodiment of God's compassion. And what does it mean that compassion is permanent? Mm-hmm. Even the idea of God being compassion and Jesus being God's compassion in a bodily form. Wow. That really raises some interesting questions, because compassion, of course, is situational. It's fluid. It doesn't always express itself in exactly the same way. We know what it is, but we also see it in a beautiful multiplicity. And so even if you think, though, that Jesus is just like this, a body who stays the same always forever in the exact same kind of sense once he's dead and then raised from the dead, there still is an incredible amount of transformative change that we go through. And in effect, Jesus changes. So with all of that, and the fact that we deny that, it is to our, I think, it becomes a problem for Western people. I think it puts us in a bad space psychologically and emotionally. Is this constant sort of seeking toward static perfection that we suspect might not really exist. But yet somehow most of our theology holds that out as our goal. And it makes us, I think, it's not theologically or spiritually very helpful.
Yeah, I think the shift that seems to be happening within like progressive Christianity, and I think you're part of that as well, is even people like Peter Rollins we were chatting a little bit about, is that looking at Jesus as a figure that really embraced humanity, his own humanity and the humanity of others, the imperfection and messiness of society, the people who are, considered unclean and impure, and to really embrace all of that, I think for me, the big shift as I reflect on my own understandings of Jesus was when this shift from believing that, God entered into creation through Jesus, this one single individual, to thinking, wait a minute, what if it wasn't just Jesus? What if God enters into creation through all of us, without exception? And I don't know, that really just kind of opened up, the way that I read and perceived the Gospels and everything. It just in a totally different light, and just thinking about this appeal of Jesus, there's something universal and transcendent about, Jesus as a symbol in a way,
And Jesus, I think that the claims for the uniqueness of Jesus become based less on sort of the singularity of Jesus as, Son of God, or however you want to explain that unique entering in. I think in the way you're describing it, Jesus emerges as the one who does that in such an extraordinary fashion. Jesus gets it to such an extraordinary level that, and I want to think that Jesus is more than just example, because I think that Jesus becomes kind of almost like the model in a way, of what is possible, not in the idea of sinless perfection, all those kinds of classic terms, but the fact that we can really understand at a far more profound level than we do, and we can practice it in a far more radical and liberating way than we often do, and that Jesus holds that out for us constantly. And so I think that some of these things were actually things that I was working toward in my book, and in Freeing Jesus, and this is true with all of my work, is I'm trying to talk about very complex theological ideas in incredibly easy language. And so every one of my books is a book that, when I'm writing it, I think of someone who walks into their local bookstore and goes to the table and sees a book, called Freeing Jesus or Grounded or what have you, and picks it up and starts to read. And instead of finding all of the big words,
right.
they hear stories that invite them to reflect on their own lives. And so these different things that we've been talking about the eternity of Jesus, about the singular nature of Jesus, the unique nature of Jesus, or what's running through our conversation is also a conversation about sin. I, instead of kind of approaching those in the way that people would often do in church settings, I approach it through story. Telling a story of sitting in a classroom and a professor giving a lecture. And I would never forget this lecture. He was lecturing on early 19th century American theology and talking about the conflict over whether human beings were completely mired in sin, or whether or not we had the chance of even being good. And he quoted a 19th century theologian and said that the word sin is in the sinning. And I can remember sitting there hearing those words, sin is in the sinning. And literally my pen dropped out of my hand and I just looked up, and it was like, oh my gosh, why has no one ever said this to me before? Because that's exactly what I think it is. And then the professor went on and said, well, that's a heresy. And I went, wait a second, I like a heresy? I think I'm in trouble here. And so, that kind of thing that happens to so many people who are Christians is that you hear an idea and you go, yes, that's it. That's my experience. And then the next sentence is, but you can't have that experience. And so you're asking, sort of why Christianity is on the rocks, is I think way too many people get that second experience, that second moment where someone in authority stands in your classroom and says, yes, that might be what you think or what you feel, or that might resonate with your heart, but to hell with it. It doesn't matter, because if you believe that, you are going to hell. And I can remember when he said, that's a heresy. And then I kind of look around the classroom, and as I look around, I realize that everybody else is sort of dutifully writing notes and sort of, nodding their heads in agreement with the professor. And I felt really alone.
What do you mean by sin is in the sinning? I feel like something's going over my head a little bit. Is there?
Oh, well, the argument in the early 19th century was the idea that we're born sinners.
Mm-hmm.
We are just, there's nothing you can do to ever escape sin. That from the moment of your birth, you are a miserable sinner. And there were people in the early 19th century, even within rather Calvinist Protestant traditions, and Calvinism is the tradition that has loved original sin the most.
Okay.
But even within that, there were protesters, and there was a group of theologians who said, nope, we don't buy it. We don't buy that we're sinners from the moment that we cry our first cry into the world.
Yeah.
What we think is that you become a sinner as you sin.
Okay, so it went over my head because it was so obvious in a sense.
It is. It's really obvious. And that's what I love about theology, is that sometimes it really is obvious, and that the church makes it so much more complex. And, it shouldn't be.
Right. It's almost like, I sometimes think, I don't know, progressive Christianity or whatever, it kind of needs its own sort of, it's like the loudest voices, as we know, within the Christian tradition have seemed to say, they've kind of boiled it down. So, because to a lot of outsiders, they look at what Christianity is, and like you said, they're not going to know all of the insider language. They're not going to know all of the Bible and, the nuances and everything. They're just going to know, what's the bottom line message? And often the bottom line message is that atonement theology. It's, well, you're a sinner. You need, you're going to go to hell if you don't do anything about this problem, and Jesus is your answer. The end, And now I think people are really a lot of people are starting to react against that and just reject that completely. So it seems like, in some ways maybe progressive Christianity as a movement is a little bit more ambiguous or nuanced or diverse, or I don't know what, but I do think it comes back to what you said about that, Jesus is really about compassion. If it really if we need a bottom line, that's not a bad one, probably.
And if that's the sort of the continuing state of Jesus, what I share in this particular piece is that I've known that Jesus through these. Predominantly, these are not the only ways I've known Jesus, but these are the dominant 6 images of my life. And those images are pretty simple: friend, teacher, savior, Lord, way, and presence. Mm-hmm. And so the compassionate one, the embodied compassion of God, who in a unique and beautiful and memorable, amazing way, revealed to us that we can live with compassion front and center, the way God intended.
Right.
It nevertheless comes to us in different ways and different times, and companions us along our lives pathways, so we can understand that. And the book arcs from sitting in a Sunday school classroom when I'm about 3 years old in that Methodist church I described where I was baptized, and hearing for the very first time someone tell me the story about how Jesus loves the little children. And I remember sitting in that circle, the walls of the Sunday school room were painted green, this kind of almost lime green color, which I would later learn was World War II surplus paint. And the entire Methodist denomination in the years after World War II bought the Army's World War II surplus lime green paint,
Oh my
and
gosh.
painted the entire denomination with that color. And so
I wonder
every
if that was
Methodist,
a good idea.
I don't know, but every Methodist I ever knew who grew up in the 1950s and 1960s remembers that color because it was the color of all of our Sunday school rooms.
Wow.
And so it was that color. And so I was sitting there in that green room on a carpet, and my Sunday school teacher, her name was Miss Jean. And she was sitting on a little teeny tiny kindergarten sized chair, even though she's a big lady, a big, grown up lady. And she told us the story about Jesus welcoming children. And after she told the story, she held up a picture, and there was a picture of Jesus. I don't think it was a particularly white Jesus. I think it was kind of a sort of a neutral Jesus that sort of bore a number of different interpretations of what he might have looked like in real life. But there were all these little children around him, and the little children were distinctively of different colors. And right next to Jesus, with her head leaning on Jesus' shoulder, there was a little blonde girl with blue eyes. And I looked at that picture, and I heard Miss Jean's story, and I thought, Jesus is my friend.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my very first ever real memory, not of the name of Jesus, which I always knew, but of Jesus, is that Jesus welcomed all the little children, and Jesus was my friend. So a story arcs from there through all these other different images, and then lands in another circle at the very end, but I'll hold off telling that part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I was curious to hear. I mean, yeah, it just makes me think about how, in a way, a lot of us, maybe in the mainline kind of traditions, get caught up maybe with trying to understand Jesus intellectually, maybe more now than ever. I don't know, just kind of, we live in a very cerebral culture. But I think part of the power of sort of, evangelicalism and that kind of thing, and is more of trying to experience Jesus through other ways, like emotionally or through our hearts. And some of that is still really important, I think, and powerful. And I think accounts for some of the appeal of those other kind of denominations that experience Jesus in a different way. I listened to some other podcasts as well, and there's one that has guided meditations called Methods, and they had one based on Ignatian contemplation, imaginative prayer, and just kind of going into this biblical scene with Jesus. And that was like a totally different way of experiencing Jesus than I have in many years, if not ever, an emotional one rather than an intellectual one, So yeah, I mean, we got to keep our minds open to different ways of experiencing Jesus. And I think too, and maybe it's this kind of in a part of the book I haven't read yet, but I know you had talked in the book about really at a certain point in your life for a number of years, really being caught up in a very sort of more fundamentalist or conservative understanding of theology and who Jesus was to you. And I'm really fascinated by that, especially in the sort of cultural and political context that we're living in now. What was it that caused you to shift out of that? I mean, maybe we have to read the book to find out, but how did you kind of escape that or whatever, if that makes sense?
I really like the questions you're asking. They're making me think of any number of different interesting trajectories of conversation. so you kind of got me going. Before I talk specifically about getting out of evangelicalism, I sort of love your comments about how the mainline churches, the brand name liberal churches, are that we get stuck in our heads. Mm-hmm. And that's been our strength we've actually, those traditions, people in those traditions have done brilliant theology and biblical studies, especially in the last 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, I think that people outside of those circles don't necessarily know this might be one of the richest periods of theological and biblical work that the church has probably done in the last 400 years.
Wow.
And I mean, I think it is. I mean, my bookshelves behind me just demonstrate the depth and complexity and sort of profound intellectual endeavor that Christians from these kinds of denominations have been involved in, and it's been glorious, I think. So that's been one of our great strengths, but that's also our big weakness, is that the technical vocabularies and the intellectual categories and the titles and frameworks that we've put on all these things become the way we talk about theology. And I love all those books, and I honor all of my colleagues who have worked so hard to do that, but they are so out of temper with the kind of culture that we live in. And so the question becomes is how does if we want to call it progressive Christianity, sort of the alternative Christian voice, how does it break through in a culture where, say, conservative evangelicals have such a clear story about things like sin and who Jesus is and how you get saved and what that word atonement means. And so the whole thrust of the book that I just wrote was to talk about all of the big words and never use one of the big words. And instead take people who are my very brainy readers into a place of deep heartfulness and help them to find that Jesus from that Sunday school classroom again, or the Jesus that they first encountered as a teacher, or the Jesus that they first knew as a loving Savior, or however they've known that Jesus, to feel it, because the language of emotion and feeling and experience, those languages are the driving languages of the 21st century. And if we can't be out there with good theology, working in the lingua franca, that's a big fancy word. The lingua franca, of course, means the language of the day or the language of the people, the common language.
Yeah.
If we can't work in the lingua franca of the day, what good are we? All we're doing is writing beautiful, amazing books to sit on the shelves that are behind me. And for somebody to find in 500 years and say, oh my gosh, the Christians of the early 21st century were really smart.
Yeah, it's interesting you point that out. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So that's what becomes my passion, is to help liberal Christians feel again. And in that helping of liberal Christians feel again, also reintroduce Christianity to the people who have been so wounded by those other forms of faith. They've been run out, they don't want to talk about it anymore because they have been exiled or shunned or almost really abused, and sometimes violence done against their bodies by conservative Christianity. And so I've asked myself, how do we have a conversation with the walking wounded, the post-Christian, right, among us, and to try to come to some new place together. And all I can figure out is in this language of storytelling, and of taking rich theological ideas and moving them out of just the gray matter parts of our body and planting them here and centering them, really making them the heart of the matter. That's
how Jesus did it, right?
Well, that's how I understand Jesus as a teacher.
And I, there's a lot of teachers that I've appreciated in my life, but also I think of there's this one Buddhist teacher, Jack Kornfield, and he teaches meditation and all that stuff. And I remember going through a period of anxiety, and his talks were some of the most helpful to me. And he really does focus in on stories that particularly about compassion, and stories that really hit you in the heart, and as much as I feel like I'm an intellectual and I like thinking about all that stuff, when I was going through a difficult time, and those are the talks that really spoke to me and helped me. And so I think it's, I think your instinct is right to kind of go into the storytelling and to really go for the heart.
And that's the way, I think that things change in a good direction. Is that stories can motivate people to do powerfully evil things. And we just saw that, I think, in January 6th with the insurrection at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Is those people were told a compelling story. It was a story about the end times. It was a story about lies and truth. It was a story about something that was being taken from them. It was a story about their own power to change the world. And it was a story then they took to heart. They embraced, and it caused them to go off and do this insanely violent thing that wound up killing 5 people and sort of undoing some of the threads of American democracy, changing the history in which we actually live.
Yeah.
And so stories do that. And so it's incumbent, I think, upon people who have a different story and a different vision to be able to tell that story in equally compelling and motivating kinds of ways that lead people not towards destruction, but instead toward the good, toward building something that's beautiful, restoring the common good, saving creation, doing justice in the world, all that kind of stuff.
Amen.
So that's I think the really important part of this sort of work that I've been putting in the world is just, I keep saying the same thing. I feel like over and over again in every book, although I say it about a lot of different stuff, but tell the stories, tell the stories, tell the stories. I feel like someday I'm going to run out of stories in my own life, and then I'm going to have to figure out something else to do. So that leads me to the other story that you ask about. And that is the story about evangelical religion. And my life has really what I would call 3 very distinct periods, and same way Christianity after religion had 3 distinct chapters in the middle, or 3 distinct sections. My story, my early story took place in that Methodist church in Baltimore City, running from the time I was born, 1959, up until 1972. And in 1972, my parents moved from Baltimore, where not only I grew up, but they grew up and their grandparents grew up and everybody grew up in all the generations before them. So they moved from Baltimore to Phoenix, Arizona. And it was huge. I mean, it is a mind-blowing move in 1972. And this is before people just sort of regularly got on airplanes and had vacations and all that kind of stuff. Most middle-class people didn't do that kind of thing, go on those kind of big vacations. And so we moved all the way across the country. Wow. And in that dislocation, that geographical dislocation, I really sort of lost my ties with Methodism and wound up in an evangelical church that my friends introduced me to. And so the center section of the book, which is basically 1972 through about 1990, no, they'll go to about 1989 or so, okay. 88, 89. So before 1990. It was a pretty big chunk of my life was within the context of evangelicalism. And there the titles of Jesus that I highlight are Savior and Lord, which are very conventional titles within evangelicalism for Jesus. But I turn the prism on them. I don't really kind of go along for the whole evangelical game plan, as it were. And I define them very differently. And so readers of the book will say, well, wait a second, I grew up in evangelicalism and that's not quite the way I saw it. Well, it's because I was always a little bit of a heretic. And so, but when I was in my late 20s, that was when I sort of began to say, wait a second, this is not for me. And in the chapter, which is called The Way, which is the 5th chapter of Freeing Jesus, so it opens up the back part of the book. It opens up what I would call my sort of full adult life in Jesus, moving from about the age of 30ish up until now. So it takes up most, like I said, most the last 2.5 decades or so.
Mm-hmm.
In that, when that chapter 5 opens, I had become convinced. Remember the professor who told me that I was a heretic because I didn't believe in original sin? Well, when I looked around that classroom and I saw that all of these other people believed in the fact that we were sinners from our birth, I thought, well, I guess there's something the matter with me. And so I went along with the game plan. And I myself, in my mid to late 20s, became part of this very conservative movement of what was then called the New Calvinism. And it wasn't quite fundamentalism. It was far more intellectual than that. But it had all of these very hyper orthodox, conventional theological categories about the things we were just sharing about, the big words. And it had a very particular idea of Jesus. And these new Calvinists wanted to basically restore a world of order and authority. That their idea was that the thing that was wrong with us as individuals and was wrong with America is that we had become disordered.
Sounds very like dystopian, like supervillain.
Well, that's kind of the way it presents itself in the book too. There are people who I've gotten emails from people who have had very strong emotional reactions to it, saying that they were sitting at the edge of their chair when they were reading through chapter 5, just hoping I would get out.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's a lot of harrowing narrative in that chapter. And the harrowing narrative is of a girl who once sat in a nice Methodist circle with a Jesus who was her friend, who gets taken down this road where the way is towards destruction. And it really does wind up being abuse. It was a way of self-abuse. It was a way of self-violence. And I talk about how Calvinist theology plunged me into the dark corners of mental illness. And I almost did not get out. And it was in that place, which was really kind of it was the theological and personal bottom of my life. I remember sitting at one point on a floor and thinking, what am I going to do now? I was completely alone. It was a very cold, hard cement floor. And I felt like the earth was about to open up and swallow me. And I thought, I wish it would. And it was there that I understood that Jesus as the way could be the wrong way. That we as human beings could create a Jesus that walked down a path that leads to death. And that we put all that on Jesus. And we'll say, I was just following Jesus. Jesus wants this. Jesus wants that. Jesus wants the other thing. When the truth of it is, it's really our fear of chaos. It's our fear of disorder. It's our need for control. It's our desire for political power that takes us down there, and we assign that to Jesus. And that's what I had done. And I did it with a lot of other people, including my first husband, my friends, college professors, you name it. I had friends. We were on that road. And I got further down that road and I went, I can't be here. And I knew at that point that I either had to continue, that would be the rest of my life, that I would be on that road. My life might end right where it was, or I had to turn around and find my way back to some different road. Mm-hmm. And I did the third thing. Wow. I turned around and I worked my way, crawled my way backwards until I figured out where there was a different path, and I went the other way. And that's where I discover, and the narrative is almost like a relief. It's a relief talking about it. What I discover is that Jesus really is a way of love. not a way that leads to destruction. And while I was writing that chapter, although I don't quote it in the book, I was clearly remembering the Deuteronomy passage where God says to the people of Israel, "Today I lay before you two ways. One is the way that leads to destruction. One is the way that leads to death. And the other is the way of life." And I realized that that beautiful Deuteronomy pronouncement was also true of Christianity. In effect, that in the presentation of Jesus, the embodiment of Jesus in the world, God says, I really, today I lay before you two ways. One is a way of death and the other is a way of life. And you can create a way of death and you can call it the Jesus way and it will take you to the wrong place. Or you can follow this way, which is the always intended way, the way of love, the way of compassion. And so that's how I got out. And that return, that turning around, the crawling, the finding of the new path and the beginning to walk in a new way, that took about 4 years.
It wasn't a single moment or anything. Yeah.
There were single interesting moments along the way. And I do write about some of those single interesting moments. Right. But it took work. It was hard and it was long. And there were moments when I thought, oh, is this ever going to go anywhere? And then that becomes the trajectory of the rest of my life. And that's where the end of the book arcs towards.
Right. And I think it's important to note a couple things about what you just said is like that. And yeah, I remember reading different parts of it as well. Just there were seeds planted along the way, right? Like that moment with your professor, you kind of had that, aha, but then, oh no, that's heresy, or, it's different speakers you heard, or the professor that was associated with like Celtic Christianity, just different seeds, and those are important, right? It's like we might not be open to those things in the moment, but then we kind of file that away. And then hopefully if enough of those happen, right, then we can make a shift, and the other aspect is just that I'm starting to lose my train of thought a little bit. But but just that it does take a long time, and it's a struggle, but I think we're all better for that you and now I remember what I wanted to say. It's just that that it wasn't so, I mean, yes, it involved your intellect, right? But it sounds like in some ways there's a crucial part of the transformation that happened in your heart, and that it was a heartfelt thing, realizing that, the way of Jesus is the way of love and compassion. And so once again, just reminding ourselves the centrality of that, those emotional experiences in our lives.
I love that you notice that along the way, there were all these, and I relate them, all these interesting conversations, whether it was with a professor or a minister or a friend or a book I was reading, so there was like these content moments that opened up sort of the possibility of something different. And what usually happened for me is at the time when those things initially were presented to me, I would feel some attraction towards them, but then I would pull away. And I would sort of justify the pulling away as saying, oh, that couldn't possibly be right. Or I would argue with the person. And meanwhile, inside, I was feeling like, oh my gosh, this might be true. This might be true. But I was always kind of covering up the impulse to go forward. And so the intellectual pieces are there, but those emotional pieces are there too, because the emotional pieces were the pieces about both attraction and constraint, self-constraint, fear. The idea that I was going to lose all of my friends and my professional connections and maybe go to hell, maybe they were right, would Jesus be in a different place, or was this the only true church, those kinds of things. And yet what got me really out was not the intellectual argument. No, I knew every argument. Nobody could argue me out of anything once I kind of got my mindset on going in a particular direction. But what got me out of it all was the ability to finally hear the deepest voices inside of myself, which I think are my truest voices, and not deny them anymore. And also the being able, from that hearing of the true voice of who Diana was in the world, being able to find courage and risk, and just say that courage and risk are really the only emotional possibilities in this situation, because fear has become untenable. And so I know some of your background is in psychology, and you're probably thinking, damn, that's great therapy. And it really was. I had a lot of really beautiful help from therapists who I write about in the book, and also from several spiritual directors who I think are the people who got me past my own gray matter toward my heart. And the writer I have become, I am certainly indebted to those people for helping me uncover the voice that has always been within.
Yeah. I imagine that going through this experience, and sharing it with others, I mean, imagine that it makes us kind of feel a little measure of compassion toward, in these times that are so divisive, so it's easy to kind of hate others or to others, and see them as separate from ourselves, to have some sense of compassion and empathy for as sad of a situation as it is, to have some compassion for what they're caught up in.
Yeah, I don't find myself at this point in my life angry at sort of those white evangelical places where I spent times in my life. I have been in the past very angry. And also, anger doesn't even really begin to describe it. I would call it more fury, rage almost. And sort of a denial that, I was never really part of them. It was all for, I would kind of just cut that part of my life away and sort of didn't talk about it, and just thought it was all bad. And this project actually called me to go back to that and ask myself the question, what were my memories of Jesus at that time? Or to ask that 15-year-old girl, really, why did you go to that church? What were the one part of Diana says, what were you thinking? And then the other part of me has now learned to say, what were you thinking? And in that second question, which became the sort of interrogating question that I applied to myself as a writer while working on the book, what were you thinking? Right. Is a far more gentle question. And I was able to answer that. So instead of judging my actions by what were you thinking, I invited myself to recall where I was at 15 and what were the motivations. No, I didn't become an evangelical because I wanted to be a racist or anti-feminist, or that I wanted to join a political party, and I thought that all of my Democratic friends were going to hell. I didn't think of any of that. I wanted to know Jesus, and I was longing for a sense of freedom and home.
Yeah.
And I found those things in this one particular church. And to have, I think that's part of the amazing story of our lives, is that not everything happens for a reason, but everything that happens matters. And so while I can't say, oh yes, you wandered into that church because you're going to become the person that you become, so God had a reason for that. That to me seems bad theology. But the fact that I did wander into that church, and the fact that I did find Jesus, it mattered in who I became and what the longer story of my life was. And so I was able to just sort of pick up those pieces, reclaiming what I had denied about my own experience. And in doing that, I felt a sense of warmth and forgiveness, really, towards the communities that I had previously been so angry about. And literally in the last year, just the anger level about my own life story and my anger about white evangelical spaces has just receded, even while I can still be a critic and say, yeah, there's an awful lot there that contributes to racism, that's contributed to the political environment that we're in, that led people to the steps of the Capitol on January 6th, that continues to create the atmosphere of division in our country. So I can say all of those things, but it doesn't make me hate them. And it doesn't also make me hate myself for that having once been part of my experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's something that, is good for a lot of us to hear that, hopefully there's a way out of this, and at least in terms of our own anger towards each other. I think it's an important starting place if we can get to a place where we at least aren't so angry or hateful towards one another,
And I sure understand, that people who listen to your podcast, might feel an incredible amount of that anger and that inability to forgive. And in that case, my story is no judgment on your story. My story is just your story. It's just my story, and I receive your stories. And so somehow in that table we set together, I love your title of your podcast, The Second Table. We're feeding each other our stories so that we can live in a more compassionate world. And that is always my dream. So I would never want people who have been wounded by that world of white evangelicalism, which is also so gay phobic and everything else that comes with it. I would never want you all to think that I was giving them a pass or giving them a pass for having hurt you.
Right. Absolutely.
Because I don't. But for myself, there is forgiveness that has come in my experience that I needed to embrace.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. So, yeah, I notice we're kind of coming towards the end of our time here, but I just want to ask one more kind of question, I guess, kind of circling back a little bit to what we talked about at the beginning, I'm a young pastor just starting out in a United Church of Christ congregation, coming to the end of my first year at the church. It's been such a strange time to enter ministry, I'll tell you. But once again, I know you've just written and thought a lot about the future of the church. And I guess I'd just ask, do you have any advice for someone like me or for our church kind of, what would you say, to someone starting their sort of career in ministry? Like I said, such a crazy time to enter ministry. But as I'm kind of questioning the future of the church and the future of Christianity and all that, any words of advice?
Well, I think I've certainly put a lot of words on pages with advice, and so I'm happy to have done that, and I stand by 99.5% of that advice that I've written down. I think it's all pretty good advice. But the place that my heart takes me today, and when people ask me that question, is I dream of you living right now lightly. So often, I think in church communities, we get caught up in focusing either on the past or on the future. And so if you get focused on the past, everything becomes nostalgia, and you keep looking to looking backwards and saying, oh, if only the Sunday school was like it was in the 1950s, or what have you. I want the building to be full again, kind of thing. Then you develop a congregation that's full of regret and sorrow. Actually, nobody wants to come to a sad church. And then if we look too much to the future, since we're limited human beings, we can do a certain amount of planning. We can do a certain amount of speculating. We can do some wise sort of looking ahead. But if you go too far in that direction, what that does is it raises a lot of anxiety, because the trends and the things we can see are not terribly optimistic for the future of Christianity. And when at least in the United States, pretty optimistic in a lot of other places. But in terms of growth and in terms of voice and sort of the shaping power of Christianity related to cultures around the world.
Yeah.
So that's actually pretty optimistic in some other locations. But for us, it's a hard story to kind of look at the future. And so when we look out there, we become very anxious. And one of the things that we all know about anxious people is they don't make very good decisions. And when you function out of fear, you're really not acting out of your best selves.
Right.
And so I've been now encouraging my friends to just kind of be in the here and now, and love one another, do what you do well, even with more joy.
You sound like a good Buddhist.
I'm so grateful for that. I was going to say live in gratitude, let go of what you can't control.
Yeah.
I guess that is a whole kind of Buddhism.
Well, you were friends with Marcus Borg, right? I think you wrote it in the book, kind of, having dinner with him. And he wrote, right, a little bit about, I have a book he edited, Parallel Sayings with Jesus and Buddha, so I think, there's those who kind of see those two as kindred spirits, Jesus and Buddha.
Thank you for, I love Marcus. I'm still really good friends with his widow, and she's one of the spiritual anchors in my life. She was an Episcopal priest and has retired since his death. But you think about the passages in the New Testament, Jesus himself, look at the lilies of the field,
Yeah, it's there.
And it's totally there. And I think that, mainline and liberal churches don't spend enough time looking at the lilies of the field. And I think that we would do better off if we did.
Thank you, Diana. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I'm honored that you came onto the show, and I've really been enjoying your book, and I hope others do as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess also, is there any where you want to highlight, like where people can find your work online and things you're working on and that kind of thing?
I have a website, www.dianabutlerbass.com. And that sort of points you in a lot of different directions. You can sign up for my newsletter. You can find where my Twitter account is, all those kinds of normal social media things, ways we connect in these days.
Great. I will put that in the show notes.
Great.
Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.